Record. Cool. Right. Here we go. How to become a commercial novelist, a case study. Come on, PowerPoint. Right. The early years of struggle. Cue violins. I was writing a novel every 2 years or so. You know, if you're working and you only write on a Sunday, it's going to take you 2 years to write a novel, to be honest. And then after the 2 years of writing a novel, I would send it to the publishers of fantasy as listed in the Writers and Artists Yearbook 2021. And there are only about 10 to 12 publishers. So every 2 years, I was sending my first chapter and cover letter as a first-time writer to 10 or 12 publishers. Now, I did that for about 6 or 7 books, because once I'd been rejected with that novel, I was like, I don't know what else to do with this novel. I better try another one. Now, I got a little bit better with each book, but I'd done 7 novels, and I was sending each novel to the same 10 or 12 every couple of years, and 14 years had passed, and I was still not published. And I was like, should I give up? Should I just get the message that they don't want these first-time writers who haven't got a fan base and, you know, whose novels aren't going to sell that many? So I had a breakthrough conversation with a mate of mine whom you're going to meet next week, this scriptwriter guy. And he said, so let me get this straight. You're making, 12 submissions every 2 years. So that's 6 a year. Do you really think you're going to win the lottery with just 6 submissions a year? He's like, and you've wasted those 2 years writing the novels that nobody wants. What's the point of that 2 years? I'm like, I don't know. I don't know what to do. And he's like, well, you're an idiot. He said, what you've got to do is improve your hit rate. And I was like, I don't know what that means. And he said, look, in script writing, we don't write the entire movie that we've thought of. We just write an 8-page document called a treatment, and we send that. It would be like your first chapter with a synopsis, which is all you're allowed to submit anyway. Stop writing the whole book before you submit. Just write loads of first chapters to loads of different novels in maybe different genres, and then you can start submitting to 50 publishers a year. 50 every year. You're just increasing your hit rate. And he's like, and if you can make sure that first chapter stands alone as a short story, you can also enter it for competitions and magazines. Suddenly we've gone from 50 to 100 submissions a year. Then you're buying 100 lottery tickets for one draw. You've got a much better chance of covering all the numbers. I was like, oh, all right then. So this was the next step. I was like, I've got to increase my hit rate, my number of submissions per year. And I took his advice. I wrote an opening chapter called Necromancer's Gambit, which stood alone as a short story. It was about a 10,000 word chapter. It was a zombie story. A necromancer is a magician who raises the dead. I entered it for loads of competitions and I submitted it to publishers and agents. And the thing with competitions and magazines is you usually get feedback, which you don't normally get with agents and publishers. And I made the long list in a competition, and one of the publishing people involved in judging said, if you finish the novel, do send it to us. And that's the first time that an agent or a publisher is like, we kind of like your idea. We'd like to see the novel. And I got really quite excited. And I literally then wrote Necromancer's Gambit in 1 year instead of 2 years, because I'm like, someone wants my novel. So it kind of gave me that push and motivation. But then it got rejected by that person who said, we'd like to see the novel. And I was like, oh no, I was quite disappointed. Now, I'd written quite a fresh kind of second world fantasy with zombies, which is highly unusual. You don't normally get a second world fantasy with zombies. And it had gods and demons as well. And I was getting all this feedback of, it's not bang in the middle of the genre, and that's why we're rejecting it. And I was thinking, but my originality, you know, the new contribution to the genre is kind of what sets it apart as attractive, but you're rejecting it for not being, you know, the same as everything else. And I was like I was a bit bamboozled by that. And then my mate said, look, if you really believe in your work, just put it out there, let it prove itself in the market, self-publish it, you know. And if you could sell a load of books, you'll prove to these publishers that, you know, it is fresh, original, and what people want. And because I had the money, I decided to then follow his advice again. And I self-published Necromancer's Gambit. And indeed, I self-published 2 more books in the sequence, Necromancer's Betrayal, Necromancer's Fall. Now, we didn't really have, I mean, Kindle wasn't massive back in those days. And so I used, for self-publishing, I used a company that's known as a POD, a print-on-demand company called Author House. Now, what they did, in addition to putting it on various websites, was that they put copies in Waterstones, like actual books on actual shelves in front of actual book buying customers, like people who have identified themselves as wanting to buy a book, going into a bookshop, looking at books. I paid that company to format the manuscript to commercial standard, organize a book cover. I paid for a distribution deal because, you know, you need a load of books in a warehouse with trucks that take the books when a bookshop's ordered them. So you pay for a distribution deal. And if a bookshop, say, is going to order 5 copies, but then those books don't sell in 6 months, they'll want to send them back and get their money back. Because if they haven't got that sale or return policy, they're not even going to order the 5 books because it's not safe to do so, because they'll get lumbered with 5 books that might not sell. So I paid for quite a big package. Now the package was big on the first book, Necromancer's Gambit. That was about $2,000 for the first book. But beyond that, because that sold well, and I knew that stores were going to order the books 2 and 3, it only cost me £500 for each of the other 2 books. And I had books in Waterstones. And I would go into local stores, talk to the manager and say, I'm a local author. Here's a sample copy of my book. You can order it through the central warehouse. There's a sale or return policy. Would you like a book signing? And he'd say, sure. If there's a sale or return policy, not a problem. We'll order 20 copies. If you can sell 10, we'll be happy, and we'll send 5 of them back and keep 5 for the shelves. So I started doing that every single weekend. And I swear I've done about 200 book signings up and down the UK. As a result, across the trilogy, I sold 6,000 books in Waterstones. Now, given that you're only making £1 on each book, and given that it cost me about $3,000 to kind of get the books out there, I've made about £3,000 on 3 books, which is £1,000 a book, which for self-published is not bad. And I was then like, well, I can't keep self-publishing because I've spent every weekend given up to book signings. What do I do now? I went to the National Convention for Fantasy, which is known as the British Fantasy Society Convention. And I went with sample copies of my books to meet some of the big publishers face to face, because they all attend the conventions. And I said, here's my book, here's my sales stats. And they were like, bugger me, 6,000 books? That's more than some of our commercial authors. And I'm like, well, yeah, I've done a lot of book signings, to be honest. And they're like, wow. And that's without you having a big company behind you. You've sold 6,000. And they're like, tell you what, send us your next book. We're quite interested if you can sell this number of copies. And actually, at the time, I was the biggest selling self-published author in the UK. So they were attracted by my numbers, not by the quality of my writing. That's what's important to understand. And so my next book, which I wrote, I sent to Golan's and some of the big publishers I'd met at the National Fantasy Convention. And Golan's took me on, and they gave me a 3-book deal. They gave me a book advance of £10,000 per title, which was a lot more than I was making on my self-published books. And then Random House bought the rights from Gollancz to translate it into German, and the author gets some money from that. And it was a global book deal. And I thought, this is it. I'm made. I'm George R.R. Martin. I'm going to be famous. I'm going to have millions of readers. I'm going to have a TV series and all of that. And no, that's not how it works, unfortunately. You need to sell about 100,000 copies before film companies are interested. Why 100,000? Well, that's kind of the number of people who've read the book and might be an audience for the TV show. I haven't sold 100,000 copies. I've sold about 25,000 copies across the trilogy. So it's about 6,000 to 7,000 copies per book on average. And that sounds like a lot. And it's certainly more than I was doing as a self-published writer, but it's not enough. So I've had, what, £30,000 book advance from Gollancz, right? Now I have to pay that book advance back to the company. That £30,000, you pay it back, and you only pay it back at the rate of £1 for each copy sold. So if you had a book advance of £30,000, you have to sell 30,000 copies before you then start getting a royalty check every 6 months from the publisher. Okay, and if you don't sell the 30,000 copies, they'll never publish another one of your books. They drop you. So I sold 25,000 copies and I'm 5,000 copies short. So Gollancz will not give me another book deal till I've sold another 5,000, which is a lot of books, really, because those books came out in 2012, 13, 14, and I still got another 5,000 to sell. And it's all, you know, the bookshops aren't stocking many copies anymore, so I don't know where I'm going to sell those 5,000 copies unless Omar's really rich and could buy the 5,000 copies for me. But maybe not.
Sorry, no.
Damn. So I was really despondent. I've not been dropped by Gollancz, but they're like, you know, we'll still look at any submissions you make to us, but it needs to be something quite wow if we're going to take you on for another book. And I'm like, but you still made plenty of profit out of me, didn't you? And they're like, oh yeah, don't worry about that. Yeah, we're very happy about the profit we made. And I'm like, so why won't you give me another book deal? And they're like, well, for the same money, we could get quite a big American author, publish his titles in the UK with a different cover and boost that. And because of his name, he'll probably sell a lot more copies for the same money than you did. And I'm like, oh, that's a bit rude. And they're like, it's a business, Adam. We like you. We actually do like your writing, but it's a business and we can make more money with someone else. I'm like, rude. So I was a bit despondent, getting drunk at that year's National Fantasy Convention. And then you find that the indie presses come sidling up to you and they're like, are you A J Dalton? I'm like, yeah, Empire of the Saviors. I haven't sold enough books. And they're like, we'll literally publish any novel you want to give us. I'm like, really? And they're like, yeah. Because they're like, you're an established name in the market and we are a small independent publisher. But if you can sell, just your name can sell us hundreds of copies, we'll be doing well. That would be good for us. And I'm like, oh, okay then. So once Gollancz had rejected my next book, I went into a book deal with an indie publisher. And I put out a book a year with Crystal Inc. Book of Orm, Book of Angels, Book of Dragons, Book of Witches came out last year. Book of Demons has got a green light for next year. And then the Book of the Dead will be the year after that. I sell, you know, a few hundred copies per title. Now, you've got to remember, it's only £1 a copy, so I'm only making a few £100 with each book. But each book in the sequence, you know, if you get a new reader on one of your later books and they realize there were other books, they'll go back and read all the books in the series. So actually, I get knock-on cascading sales if you can keep putting books out with that publisher. I keep my fan base engaged. It's good for the CV. You know, that advanced information sheet that you send to new publishers with your publication record. But it's not big money, to be honest. But it keeps me in the game. It keeps Golans interested. It keeps them looking at my next title. They're tracking my sales stats with Crystal Ink, and Golans are like, maybe we should give you another book deal. And I was like, it's still a lot of work for very little return. Do I want to keep doing this? I mean, it's helped my university application, so I'm like, do I really want to keep publishing with indies? And then I went to the National Fantasy Convention, and then I met a new type of publisher who is a more academic publisher, and they said to me, God, you're A J Dalton, and you've been successful. You're the biggest selling self-published author of fantasy in the last 10 years. You've had a big trilogy with Golans, and you've published with indies as well. You know so much about the industry and the genre, and you even then went and did a PhD in it. And I was like, yeah, I just gave them Empire of the Saviors with a 10,000 word essay about why my book was so good. They were like, we'll publish your PhD essay. We'll publish that. And I'm like, but it's only 10,000 words. They're like, yeah, we'll call it a chap book. It's like a really slim publication. And we'll publish anything academic that you want to write about the genre. And I'm like, okay, I didn't know that was a thing. And so I have since then, since 2016 to 18, started publishing genre-related academic material. And some of you will be aware that my title, The Satanic in Science Fiction and Fantasy, is the core text on one of the modules that I teach. So that helps with sales. Don't worry, most lecturers do that. Paul Cobley makes his book on narrative the core text on his modules, and so on. Now, there are not many publishers who do academic material about genre. It's a bit of a growth area. Luna Press, based in Scotland, do, however, pretty much own the entire niche in publishing collections of essays on Tolkien or on different types of fantasy, or they put out a book on Afrofuturism in science fiction and fantasy, which is, you know how Black Panther is about imagining an alternative future for an African country if there'd never been the colonial era. And Black Panther is an example of Afrofuturism in sci-fi fantasy. And they've published collections of essays on that and different aspects. I did an essay on gender identity and sexuality in fantasy and sci-fi, and that book won the national prize for the British Sci-Fi Association. So I have a little trophy on my shelf saying prize winner. And again, it's good for your CV when you want to submit different types of work to publishers and agents. If any of you are interested, you could write a 3,000 to 4,000 word essay on Tolkien right now, and Luna Press Publishing would include it in their new Tolkien anthology that's due in August. Okay, so if you check the Luna Press Publishing website, Jodie and Amanda, maybe you could co-author an essay about The Hobbit, and you'd have that published by Luna, potentially. It's also good to know that there's an academic circuit on Tolkien. There are various conventions and conferences around the UK, and you can meet agents and publishers around the Tolkien kind of industry. So there are real opportunities if that's kind of your area of interest. And oddly, the royalty rate is so much better on academic writing related to genre. It's anywhere between 25% and 50% royalty rate. Whereas with creative writing, you're looking at about an 8 to 10% royalty rate. So academic writing pays 5 to 10 times better, but you don't necessarily sell as many copies unless it's a genre type thing, okay? And that is the fourth type of publishing that I've been involved with. So I've done the self-publishing, mainstream publishing, indie publishing, and now academic publishing. Lessons learned. I have been rejected many, many, many times, dozens and dozens of times. But rejection should not be the same as dejection. If you're going to survive attempt trying to be a professional writer, you need a thick skin. You need to understand that the basis of you being rejected is probably not that the quality of your writing is rubbish. They are rejecting you usually based on for commercial reasons, like that's not selling very well right now, so we're not kind of interested. J.K. Rowling's Harry Potter was rejected by 20 publishers before it got accepted by a very small press called Bloomsbury. Bloomsbury were very small at the time. They are now, of course, a world leader thanks to J.K. Rowling. William Golding with Lord of the Flies, which is, you know, a standard text in schools for GCSE, was rejected by 29 publishers, and it's now considered one of the greatest works of young adult fiction in the UK. And Marlon James, do you remember that Booker Prize winning novel he wrote? Anybody know? Have you heard of A Brief History of Seven Killings? Okay, about 5 years back it won the Booker Prize. That novel was rejected by 87 publishers, and it went on to win the Booker Prize. So do understand, it's not that you're a rubbish writer that decides on whether you get rejected, okay? It's just finding the time and the place and convincing someone you can sell and that your work will sell, okay? Hopefully you understood from what I've taken you through is that I didn't really get lucky as such. You know, I used my own money, I self-published, I then went and did the book signings, I phoned loads of bookstores, convinced them on the phone to order copies, and then based on those sales stats, Gollancz took me on. So that wasn't luck, that was just the evidence of people like this, it sells, and the publisher saying, oh yeah, so it does. You can definitely maximize your chances of getting lucky. If you're going to go to a national convention, you increase your chances of someone listening to you if you offer to buy them a drink. That's not luck. So you buy them a drink, they listen to you, you pitch your novel, 60 words, and they'll be like, oh yeah, that's interesting, here's my business card, send me something. That's not really luck, you know, you're kind of making opportunities for yourself. Okay. You will also hopefully have understood from this case study that writing is the easy bit and that selling it is the hard bit. I know that you find creative writing has a load of challenges. Wait till you get to that moment of now I need to convince someone to read it or even then give me a book deal. And it's a different skill set. That's one of the big problems, that writing is a creative pursuit, whereas selling is hard-nosed business communication and pitching. And it's a different skill set, and you kind of need to make sure you develop both skill sets if you're going to make it in today's world, because it's a competitive world. As soon as I self-published and, you know, I was talking to people who might buy my book, they were all saying, do you have a website? My son's interested, he'd like to visit your site, you know, maybe he can send you an email because he wants to be a fantasy writer and you could give him advice. And you're like, damn, I need to keep those relationships going with my potential readers and fan base and grow it. So I need a website. And I was like, damn, I wish I'd set up this website a year ago. So I was always playing catch up on the website. So you guys really should focus on getting that sorted sooner rather than later. And then you probably gleaned that I haven't made huge amounts of money with my writing, but at the same time, I haven't lost money. And so if you're going to keep doing it and kind of not become too demotivated, it's about perhaps seeing the writing as a hobby that you find emotionally rewarding, and it covers its own costs. So it's not a vanity project because it's, you know, you're not losing money. You are improving your skill set, and every now and then you get some fan mail where a kid has said, you've changed how I see the world, and that degree of communication from one human being to another is a powerful thing and makes it all worth it. Okay, and it has all been worth it, despite the lost hair through stress and the broken marriages and all of that. There's more advice on my website, but if you have any questions, we are now ready for questions. Boom, boom. Tamara, there you are.
Thank you for the presentation, Adam. As for the first topic, would you mind telling us how you learnt your craft in summary?
How I learnt my craft? I did it the wrong way. I just sat down and thought, right, I'm going to write a fantasy book. Now, I'd never done a creative writing course. And I wrote, like, as I say, 6 or 7 books that went nowhere. And I was getting better with each book. And you know what? I could have saved myself about 14 years of struggle if I'd just done a good creative writing course where they showed me what the correct plot shape was, the correct way to handle the emotional and the rational, the Latin and the Anglo-Saxon, and that can save you years of heartache. So I learnt my craft the wrong and slow way. But I also learnt it by just reading loads of fantasy, and I eventually did kind of get on top of all of it. So I would encourage you to read in the genre that you also want to write in. Okay.
And I'll hand you over to Fama and then Maite for more questions on
that. So you've had like loads of publishers who've kind of rejected your books. If you were to go back to the ones that kind of rejected you earlier on, do you think that they would show you some sort of respect given the success that you've already had? After
they would now, and I delighted. So there was this agent called Xeno Agency who rejected me with Empire of the Saviors that Gollancz went and took on. And I went back to Xeno. I met them at a fantasy convention. I'm like, hey, I'm that guy you rejected with Empire of the Saviors. Gollancz, the market leader in fantasy, took it on and gave me a global 3-book deal. So what the hell do you know? And the guy shrugged. He's like, yeah, it happens all the time. He's like, look, honestly, we get commercial standard fantasy submitted to us every week, and we can't publish all of it. We kind of only are interested in the ones with a really good commercial proposition. And clearly you've managed to put that together, so well done you. I was like, oh. And he's like, and I bet you've got an agent.
Is that the only reason that they want to publish someone like commercial value?
Yeah.
That comes first before anything else. They
are running a business.
Yeah, that makes sense.
It's not an art appreciation gallery or something like that. And so it's always important to remember the True Blood example. You know those vampire books, True Blood.
Yeah, I'm thinking of like True Blood. Like I don't know about True Blood, but I'm thinking of what's that really like raunchy that turned into film? Yeah, 50 Shades. That turns out, like I hadn't read it, had ever read it, but turns out loads of people saying that it's quite bad.
It's really bad. It's really bad. And you know, no agent or publisher would say it was good writing, but they don't care because it's the biggest selling book in human history. True Blood, the vampire series, 12 books, was rejected by every publisher in the Western Hemisphere for 2 years. And then because Twilight made vampires popular, Charlene Harris's phone went crazy and she was being offered millions of dollars on the phone. And it's the same books. It's exactly the same books, you know?
So is it just people becoming interested in like what?
That area. Okay. Yeah, in that subgenre.
The hype.
So, so right now, do you remember there was this whole craze with Gone Girl, Girl on a Train, Girl on a Plane, blah, 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 blah. That bubble's burst now. But there was a time, if you wrote a book with Girl on it would sell. Every agent and publisher would take it.
And made her an alcoholic and crazy, and then you'd sell.
Yeah, exactly. And it would sell. But nobody wants those books anymore. So agents and publishers are always trying to read the market to see what's big, what's next. And if you happen to deliver a book to them, as they decide that's what the market wants, you're in. But it's luck. But writers should also try and read the market. So I told a mate of mine who was trying to get his breakthrough, you've got to write a Viking fantasy book right now, because I think a year, 18 months from now, Vikings are going to be massive. Did he listen to me? No. 18 months later, Viking fantasy became massive. And I'm like, there you go, you're an idiot.
Is that what happened with 50 Shades of Grey? Or did that just pop out of nowhere?
the market, we were ready for a new, so every 7 years there is a kind of a sex book as the new generation discovers sex and racy literature. So before 50 Shades of Grey, it was Jackie Collins books. Before Jackie Collins books, it was Suzanne Cooper? Jilly Cooper. Before Jilly Cooper, it was Emmanuel. It happens every 7 years. And I think publishers were like, we think erotic fiction is becoming popular. Twilight, there was all this fuss. 50 Shades of Grey was a kind of a rip-off fan fiction of Twilight. So it kind of had the sex domination stuff with the kind of pseudo-vampire stuff. And publishers were like, yeah, this is the one. And it exploded. It exploded. I put out the Book of Witches just when Fort Salem was coming out, because I'd sensed that witches were going to become big with Sabrina and stuff like that.
Yeah.
It sold pretty well. It sold a couple of hundred copies since August, so not bad for an indie title. Pretty good. Sorry, there's a question in the chat. Who's this? Marissa. Oh, Marissa. Okay, how do you find time to write and edit while maintaining your passion for that particular project? I block out Sunday afternoons. I literally timetable my creative writing. Now, if you know that you're only going to have that Sunday afternoon for, say, 2 hours blocked out in your timetable to do any writing, you find that you're thinking about what you're going to write in the background, so that when you then sit down on the Sunday afternoon, you're just downloading what you've already been percolating in your head during the week. Voila.
Maite, do you have any questions for that? For learning your craft?
Yep. So mine are, what are the creative challenges when writing a story and the biggest mistake in your writing?
What are the creative challenges
in creating your stories?
The biggest challenges?
Yeah, when you write them.
I've never had a problem with writer's block. You know, some people can't think of ideas, don't know what to write. I've never had that problem. I think if you get writer's block, you're basically just doing it wrong. You're putting yourself in the wrong place, you're thinking about the wrong things, you're reading the wrong things. I actually tend to have the same problem as you, matey, with my writing, which is having too many ideas and having to decide what not to include. I mean, I keep a book of ideas, a diary by my bed, because as I'm falling asleep, I tend to get a lot of ideas as my brain's churning. That's known as fuzzy thinking. It's kind of when you're like really tired and your brain is kind of, the synapses are connecting in a slightly different manner. You sometimes realize the clue to that. You realize the answer to a crossword clue that you've been trying to work out all day. And it's because your brain's begun to relax, you kind of get these ideas. So I just have this notebook by my bed, put the ideas down, and then I haven't forgotten them in the morning. So that's the challenge, is knowing what not to include, what to choose for my next project. And I usually try and choose my next project based on reading the market and trying to anticipate what will be big next year. And then the biggest mistake was ever daring to have an opinion about other fantasy writers. Once I had my book deal with Golan's, giving people an honest criticism about their books, if they're a competitive fantasy author, will upset them greatly, and they'll write fake reviews of your books on Amazon and things like that. Never read your own book reviews on Amazon, because that will upset you. But it's so hard to resist. It's so hard to resist. Okay, there you go. Tamara.
So I'm sure your path to becoming a professional has been very challenging. What would you say is your biggest challenge?
In any particular area, or just generally?
In general.
What's the category of question?
Challenges.
Challenges. Biggest challenge. I think, yeah, I mean, I've not been fully dropped by Golan's, so they always want me to send me my next project before the indie takes it. So Golan's always want to look at it. But I think just emotionally dealing with having had a global 3-book deal and then the publisher saying we don't want any more is really demotivating. You're like, shall I give up then? Golan's do reassure me. They're like, at least we published all 3 in the book that we gave you the contract for, because if your books 1 and 2 hadn't sold well enough, we wouldn't have even published the 3rd one. So, take that as a positive. All 3 books got published. I know other fantasy authors who, even though they had a 3-book contract, the publisher's never obliged to publish that 3rd book. They'll still pay for the 3rd book, but they won't go through the cost of production and distribution if they don't think it will sell enough. So dealing with it emotionally. So a really good friend of mine, a big American writer, he had about 9 books published in America, called John Marco, massive in dark science, fantasy and sci-fi, got dropped by his publisher. He had a mental breakdown. He can't bear going into bookshops anymore. And I think you kind of need good emotional support around you in your family, or you just need to have that robust psychology for dealing with it. And I think that's where just being a sensitive creative will see the industry destroy you. So you kind of need to have a thick skin, I'm afraid. And I think that's what the world's like these days as well, You can't be Beatrix Potter living in the countryside, sending away manuscripts every other weekend. That's not how it works anymore. You've got to be a sales machine, propaganda and marketing. So doing a short marketing course, I'd always recommend that. You can do a certificate in marketing. It doesn't take long, it's quite cheap. I learned quite a lot doing that. There you go.
Thank you, that was really helpful. Kelsey, do you have any questions?
Yeah, you've stolen 2. So I'll do my last one. I was wondering what advice you would give to another writer who is feeling discouraged about their own writing.
Well, it's always worth it. Even with the self-published book, I was like, people who knew me thought I was a deluded fool. They're like, so you're self-publishing with Author House and it's £2,000 for a book you wrote yourself and there are quite a few typos in it. Are you mad? And I was like, maybe I am mad, but as soon as you get a genuine piece of fan mail, and it was from a 16-year-old kid in Sweden who wasn't related to me, getting good sci-fi and fantasy out in Europe isn't easy because they don't have their own writers of sci-fi and fantasy in a lot of European countries, believe it or not. Belgians and Germans don't write novels in their spare time. I said to a German, what do you mean you don't write? Everyone in the UK does some writing, poems or whatever, and has it in their desk and they haven't shown anyone. German's like, why would you do this? And I'm like, how can you not do this as a human being? So anyway, this Swedish kid, there's a rare international bookshop in the middle of Stockholm, and he picked up my self-published title, which had found its way out there. He sent me fan mail saying, you've changed how I see the world. And I'm like, oh, it was all worth it. I was in tears reading that email. And it's not about it was in that moment I also realized it wasn't about the money. It's putting out a piece of creative work. And when someone gets your work and appreciates it, even if it's one person, it counts. It's about human communication, enthusiasm for the genre. It's catharsis. The writing keeps me sane. And I finally managed to get an academic job in genre, which I have to say is the best job I've ever had in my life. I mean, it really is, because it's my passion. It's all worth it. It's completely worth it. Was that your question? What was your question? I've forgotten.
I was wondering what advice you would give to another writer who is feeling discouraged.
Demotivated. Do you know Neil Gaiman? I've seen Neil Gaiman speak several times, and he's often asked that question. What advice would you give to an aspiring writer? And at University of Liverpool, he said, I'm always asked this question, and I always give them the same answer, and people are always disappointed with the answer. But it's the best answer, honestly. And he's like, first you need to start writing something, then you need to finish it, and then you need to show it to someone in the industry, like an agent or a publisher. You need to then submit it. And he's like, most people start it, they do step one, they never finish it. They never finish it. And he's like, you've got to work out the reasons why you are failing between steps 1 and 2, because people have different reasons for that. Why aren't you finishing your work? Ian Rankin often has that crisis of confidence in his work. He's like, oh, my original idea seemed so much better than what it looks like on paper. And that is a phenomenon, that spark of insight where you're like, oh, what a genius idea, never seems genius when it's written down. It seems mechanical, it seems clunky, it seems clumsy. And you need to get used to that feeling, accept that the first drafts won't be a work of genius, and get over yourself and redraft it. Get some beta readers, some friends, polish it until it goes from a lump of coal to a diamond. Something like that. But you need to work out what's breaking between steps 1 and 2 for you. Is it self-discipline? And I found that I had to tell everybody around me that I was trying to write a book, and that Sunday afternoons I wasn't available for socializing, and I would make sure I would put it off as well. I'd have cleaned the house, I'd have done the washing up, I'd have done the shopping, and then I'd be like, I've got no more excuses. I actually need to do the writing now. And my partner had been drilled on, it's 2 o'clock on the Sunday, you've done everything else, sit at your desk, pick up your pen. And she's like, I'll give you the first word to write. And literally she would stand over me, and she's like, are you ready? And I'm like, okay, what's the first one? She'd say, the. So I'd write down the, and I'm like, and she's like, well, you have to think of the second word, but you've started. Getting to the desk and actually starting is the challenge for many writers. Not matey, but many other writers. Okay, there you go.
Thank you.
Ellie, do you have any more questions to add?
I think they've pretty much been answered, to be honest. I was going to have one about, whether or not you ever have moments where you doubt yourself or your writing abilities. But I think you kind of touched on that already.
Well, I don't know. You know, even when I had a 3-book deal with Gollancz, I suffered imposter syndrome. I was like, I'm okay. I forced Gollancz into giving me a book deal because of my sales stats of my rubbish self-published books. And I felt like I'd cheated and tricked my way into the book deal. And I had imposter syndrome. And I never told anyone at parties, for example. I'd just say, yeah, I'm a teacher. I'd never say, yes, I'm a international fantasy writer. And I think you're never satisfied with your writing. So Philip Larkin, okay, had been offered the position of poet laureate. He hated his poems. He hated his own work because they were never perfect. His poems were never perfect, and he wanted them to be perfect articulations. And he was asked in an interview by the BBC, of all your poems, which is your favourite, Mr. Larkin? Very flippant, stupid question by this young BBC interviewer. And he's like, if I liked any of my poems, I wouldn't write poetry anymore. And it's actually the desire to make it good that kind of keeps you going. Have you ever done paintings and thought, I should stop now, but I'm just going to add this little bit and add this little bit, and then actually you've ruined it because you've gone too far? Sometimes it's kind of just letting your work be imperfect but good enough. Imperfect but good enough is what you want. And allow that to be, because art is never perfect and it will not please everyone. So it's kind of exercising that judgment. So yeah, there you are. So the stories I even write now, I'm like, pretty good. I'm like, yeah, a bit tropey. I've used the classic plot shape, bit formulaic. Is it very fresh? Is it very original? What are the kids writing these days? Maybe my fantasy is tired old pish by now. I don't know. There you go.
Okay, so next is about your journey to becoming a professional. I'll hand you over to Omar to ask questions about that.
Hi, Adam. I read your advice section on your website, and I got a strong sense of a worthy struggle driven by a maddening obsession. I did get that. So, what gave you the mental endurance? This is in the early days, you know. Was there pressure from parents? Was there a friend telling you, no, come on, just be an English teacher. Just, you know, why don't you be a doctor instead? You know, come on, you channel it this way.
I mean, what helped was that I've got a French mother, and the French are famously kind of arrogant, and that weird French mindset helps. It also helps that my mum's parents were both famous French writers, and so she knew what the game was like. She knew that it just needed loads of support, and she's like, you know, you gotta try it, because it's almost a calling. Like, if you have an instinct to write something, it's a curse, but it's also a blessing. It's just a thing you do. It makes you happy. It keeps you sane. And it's like being a teacher almost. You know, you don't do teaching for the money. You do it because it's a calling. You really enjoy providing insights that can change the direction of people's lives, potentially. I mean, okay, I'm exaggerating the worth of teaching, but, you know, in an idealistic sense, you know, I think some of you guys are knocking on the door of commercial standard. I mean, your story, Omar, your sci-fi piece, I could see that published if it was edited. That I could see that in a sci-fi magazine. George R.R. Martin started with short stories in sci-fi magazines, you know. And you guys are knocking on the door of that, and kind of helping you guys get there is hugely rewarding emotionally. As for the writing, yeah, it's kind of a curse, but it's that calling, it's that odd fan mail, you know, it's going to the National Fantasy Convention and being recognized and people wanting to talk to you. You kind of feel appreciated and valued. So, in the absence of kids, what else am I going to do? You know. So, does that answer?
I get because I used to work with people that were like in the nursery. They were like they said to themselves that they would only stay there for like a few years or whatever, and then they ended up, because they're working with kids, and then because it's so rewarding and like being able to help them shape them early on, I think that's what made them get stuck in there for like 17 plus years. And then I looked at that, I was quite young as well, I looked at that and thought to myself, there's no way I'm getting stuck here, so I ran away quickly. But I do understand what you're saying about like it being rewarding and then being able to like affect other people's lives as well. Because I don't know about you, but 25 years before you get like a publisher, I would have given up.
Yeah,
most likely. But
you know, I went into teaching during the 1990s recession, and just like the people you're talking about, I said to myself, this is going to be a stopgap just till the economy picks up. I'm not going to stay as a teacher, and here I am in 2021 still teaching, you know, and I realized I liked it. But what I did realize is I like teaching adults. I don't like teaching kids, because that's a different skill set. So I can't do nursery, primary type stuff. Even secondary, I'm like, yeah, they're a bit young. But
I did nursery. It was the best thing ever.
Oh really?
Yeah, it was.
Yeah, some of the English third years are going into PGCE primary. And it does seem that teaching and writing, which is kind of a critical aspect and a creative aspect, seem to complement each other quite well. You get longer holidays as a teacher, you get time for writing. J.K. Rowling was a language teacher.
I know, it was the best thing ever.
Yeah.
It was the best thing. I got like 8 weeks of holidays and so many half terms.
Yeah, the Booker Prize winner with Ghost Written, I taught with him out in British Council in Asia. He won the Booker Prize with Ghostwritten. I forget his name. But he was another language teacher, and they seem to be quite complementary pursuits. And I would recommend kind of making sure that you don't forget you need a day job to kind of pay the bills and allow you that space and time to do the creative writing, because there is a cost to it. Time is money, you know.
Yeah.
Time is income. So
Adam, I had another question.
okay.
I was wondering. You said in becoming professional, you mentioned in your seminars as well that the fantasy can become quite patriarchal and very rigid. Would it help in having sort of your antenna on sort of society, or is that something that's coming in, or was that never the case? That or something maybe you can have woke science fiction, or maybe this, that, and the other. Is that something a trend that can that be a trend in today's day?
It really is. So the leading fantasy writer in the world at the moment is N.K. Jemisin, a Black New York woman whose Broken Earth trilogy finally subverts the patriarchal nature of the hero's journey. How she did it, God only knows, but she successfully did it. It's woke, sci-fi, fantasy, genre-busting work. It starts with the anticipation of the hero's journey, but then cleverly turns it all round, and you realise, oh, I misunderstood everything. And she refuses to fulfil the end of the journey, and so kind of tips it all upside down. And there's massive LGBTQ themes. There's a full because of all the different races. There's a full spectrum of color. It's brilliant work. N.K. Jemisin.
And just a small follow-up: do you think that's a long-term thing, or do you think that's just it's going to go away in the morning and then we're back to hero's journey?
I mean, LGBTQ representation is huge in all the genres right now. Penguin, which is basically the leading publisher in the world with its Trans World group, you know, part of that group. They have a writing scheme for the top 100 literary fiction writers in the UK every year, and my wife made it this year. And basically, you needed to write an LGBTQ novel in literary fiction because otherwise you wouldn't get on the scheme. So they're going to be publishing those novels over the next few years. So that's definitely a thing. Definitely, multicultural UK is still huge as a thing. So yeah, you know, novels about people of color, etc., with Black Lives Matter as well. That's not going away soon.
I think that's going to be a module next year in genre fiction. You know, woke writing.
Well, certainly I have. So I teach a literature module called Identities in Global Literature, and I certainly dragged that far more towards Black Lives Matter type literature and post-colonialism. And Ariel, who's head of creative writing, is a post-colonialist specialist. His novel is post-colonial. So all our PhDs that are kind of dominating the faculty in literature, the numbers are huge. It's all post-colonial. That's where it's at. Good question. Good question, Omar.
So thank you. That's the question I had.
Write a post-colonial fantasy or sci-fi. You'll be laughing.
Absolutely. Post-colonial. That's just psychological. That's just modern. That's just one that's written in contemporary form, I'd imagine, if it's to do with England.
What was that TV show where the elites of society were black in the UK? It was Black UK. It was Future UK.
Is it Noughts and Crosses?
That's it. Noughts and Crosses. So
yeah, I read the books ages ago. They were like I haven't watched the TV thing, but it looks like the books were obviously way better than the thing. But that was kind of like timely, isn't it? With like Black Lives Matter and things like that. Yeah,
exactly. So that's kind of post-colonial, dystopian, or near future. That's quite cool.
All right, thank you, Adam.
No problem.
Thank you. You said you're currently working on the Book of Demons, right? Which is to be published this summer.
Yeah.
Lauren, do you have any questions about that?
Not so much that one, but maybe the Book of Witches I wanted to talk about. I wanted to know what the highlight of writing this book was for you.
I think it's the first book that actually demonstrates the critical and the creative are two sides of the same coin. So I researched the history of witchcraft in the UK to write the introduction. And then myself and 6 or 7 authors were asked to write a creative response based on that academic introduction. So, choose a main character or a main era from UK history of witchcraft and write a creative short story based on it. And the introduction on its own gets recognised by the university as an academic publication, and then the creative pieces also get recognised by the marketplace, and it gets published and we get sales stats and stuff like that. So that book has worked for me in 2 ways. One in the marketplace to keep my name kind of out there with the fan base and with other agents and publishers. And then it kind of gets recognised by the university for something called the Research Excellence Framework. Every lecturer gets evaluated by the university and then UK government based on their academic output. And you need to be publishing an article every year, an academic article. So that book ticked 2 boxes. And whenever you go for a job in creative writing at universities, they always ask you, so how does your academic work inform your creative work or vice versa? And you always mumble and fudge the answer, but actually this book is the first time where I think I kind of can demonstrate that they do inform each other. Yeah.
Just one more question. On the other side, what was the biggest challenges you faced when writing this book?
Editing Adam Lively's short story for that book, because I'm the editor. He had real problems with the past perfect tense, which is had done, had been, that tense. So there were whole sections that I had to kind of rewrite for him. So I'm really embarrassed, Adam, but because he's head of the MA in novel writing. So he's above me in rank, he's like up there and I'm just down there. So I was a bit embarrassed. And also, who his mother is Penelope Lively, the Booker Prize winner. So I was like, oh God, I'm so embarrassed. But I kind of had to do it gently. And I'm like, I hope you don't mind, but I would suggest you consider changing these verb tenses. Is that okay? And it was fine because he's a nice bloke. But then I had invited a couple of other writers to be involved and their work was terrible. And I couldn't be nice and polite to them. I actually had to say, this is awful. And it took me about 5 drafts until it was commercial standard with some of the writers. And I'm like, I'm never using them again. Blimey. That was awkward. That was awkward. There you go.
Thanks.
Would you say that, sorry, were you about to say something?
No.
Okay. Would you say that being a professional novelist is rewarding?
It has highs and lows, I think, like everything, seeing it, so I had a good friend, Michael Ward, who got signed by Gollancz at the same time as me. He got properly dropped by them and they're like, look, we're not going to be publishing any of your work again. At least Gollancz still encouraged my submissions and I have a route 1 into the publishing director and they want to see what I'm working on next usually. But this poor guy, Michael Ward, got dropped from a height and he was very bitter and broken. And it set his writing career backwards. And John Marco in America got dropped. So for those guys, it's horrible. It's, and there's nothing you can say to make it better for them. That's horrible. It's kind of worked out well for me because I'm kind of in bed with some indie publishers who will always publish my stuff. And I'm pleased to say that the head of the Crystal Ink indie publisher, because I've helped her rewrite her novel called Anna so many times now, she's been taken on by Solaris Rebellion, Abaddon Books, who publish Judge Dredd and Doctor Who, and it's her first big book deal. So I've kind of helped her get there. And I'm like, could you get them to take on one of my spare novels that I've got hanging around if Gollancz doesn't want it? So, you know, actually having business contacts and staying in the game with independent publishers is always worth it, because you need friends on your way up, and you certainly need them on your way down. There you go.
So it's all about networks.
Yeah, and working hard. It's not only about networks, it's about being slightly lucky with the right book at the right time, like with 50 Shades of Grey.
It just
Yeah.
reminds me of that saying, it's not about what you know, it's who you know, basically.
I mean,
Does that-
certainly, if you look at that presentation I gave you, again and again, I was saying, at the British Fantasy Convention, which happens every year, and there you'll meet aspiring writers, genuine readers who just like the genre, agents and publishers. They're all there, and there are panel debates on different aspects of fantasy. So, you know, if you're genuinely into fantasy, go to the National Convention. Usually it's a long weekend, so it's Friday to Sunday. Usually in a big hotel. You can either stay in that hotel or at a cheap B&B nearby, and just network with agents, publishers, and authors. Have your 60-word pitch for your own idea memorized and ready to deliver in your head. I started out doing that. It does work, and it is.
Was that still happening before the lockdown?
Yeah.
But for different genres?
Yeah, so there's a big sci-fi one, there's a big fantasy one. I know there's a crime one that happens every year as well. Horror, if you're a horror writer, Lauren, I'm sorry about this. Horror conventions come and go. Some years horror's big and you'll have a convention. Other years there are just no conventions for horror. So usually horror writers end up at the fantasy convention instead. But that's okay.
So you already kind of answered one of my questions earlier. So my one question is there anything surprising, any like reward that really surprised you along the way, something that you didn't expect, but you know?
I mean, doing so many book signings, sitting in shops, trying to engage people in a conversation, trying to make them laugh to then like you so that they might then buy your book. You end up meeting quite a few famous people, which was odd. They're like, oh yeah. And I'm like, and she's like, so I've heard of you. And I'm like, yeah, I was on a local radio the other day. And she's like, oh, you've got one of those voices. And I'm like, yeah. And she's like, oh, because I'm quite well known in the TV and press as well. I'm like, I do recognize you, but I can't place it. And she's like, yeah, I'm one of the presenters of Loose Women. I was like, oh my God, you are. Like, yeah, and I've got a book deal, and you'll meet other fantasy sci-fi writers, and they're like, oh, I should do more signings. Signings are really daunting, though, aren't they? I'm like, yeah. And I said, but you get better at book signings the more you do, because it's terrifying. The first book signing, you're too scared to try and stop. Someone's walking past your desk of books, ignoring you, and you're like, I'm like, should I talk at them and say, would you like to buy my book? Like that? It's really embarrassing. Or do you just sit there in silence? Because people feel awkward about starting a conversation with you. So you kind of have to learn how to break down that moment. You then have to learn a kind of a sales patter, which will find the incentive that person responds to. So my sales pitch for book signings, like, hello, this book's very good. And they'll look at you and like, do you read fantasy? And they kind of have to answer that question. And you say, they say I'm the best young author of fantasy on the circuit these days because all the others are dead. It wasn't me. And then all these jokes that go and go and go. And they're like, apparently my books will be, my signed copies will be worth millions once I'm dead. And they're like, and how old are you? And, you give them an obvious in to a joke. And they're like, oh, I don't read fantasy. I'm like, well, it's ideal for birthdays, weddings, and bar mitzvahs. And they'll be like, oh, yeah, okay, I know someone who does read fantasy. Maybe I'll buy him a birthday present. So you just keep, and you're like, and maybe you know someone who's an aspiring writer. Here's my business card. They can email me something if they want, and I'll give them feedback on their opening chapters. And then the parents are like, oh, Oh yes, our son wants to get into writing, so they buy your book. But you find the incentive that's going to make them buy it. Now that is cynical marketing and sales behavior. You've also got to have like the ability to be able to say it and not seem like a madman. So don't be too in their face. So just 5-degree angle leaning forwards. Try not to blink because that mimics the signs of being in love. So slightly enlarge your eyes and try not to blink. Leave your bottom lip hanging open, which again is a sign of love. And that helps you sell books, believe it or not. And I had this woman who's like, "You're the nicest man I've ever met." I'm like, I'm really not. I'm really not the nicest man. It's just smoke and mirrors. She's like, "Are you sure?" And I'm like, "Look, if I start blinking and I lean back like this, I don't seem like the nicest man." She's like, "Oh yeah, you don't." And it is Darren. You know Darren Brown, the stage magician.
Mm-hmm.
He uses a lot of similar techniques.
That sounds like flirting. The hell.
Yeah. So I make my voice a higher pitch. I'm funnier. I'm a bit.
Oh my days, this is a dirty business.
It sells, fella. It sells. It sells. What can I tell you? I'm a whore. What can I tell you? There you go. What was the question?
Oh shit, Adam.
Something a surprising reward.
Okay.
So, yeah.
Actually, discovering that I could sell so well was surprising. I didn't know I could. But I seem to be able to sell really well to housewives. Oh, the big thing. I imagine loads of young goths would come in and buy my books, but actually the kids don't tend to have that much money spare. I ended up selling to middle-aged housewives who tend to buy the books for the family. As soon as you see a middle-aged woman holding one of the plastic shopping baskets, you know she's going to fill that, and you know she's got a family, and you know she would buy a fantasy book, even if she's not a fantasy reader. So I would target middle-aged women with shopping baskets, and I did not know, because marketing people always know your audience, and I'm like, yeah, young 16-year-olds who are into fantasy and stuff, like you guys, right? But actually, I wouldn't bother with you in a bookstore. You're not old enough. I want middle-aged housewives with a budget. That's my target. It's terrible, isn't it? Terrible.
No, that's true though, because we're all in a sense, yeah. Like even if we're not selling books, we're all selling ourselves to something. Even if it's like a job interview, we're trying to sell ourselves to the flipping recruiter or so we're all selling ourselves. So
yeah, it's a competitive process. Yeah, it's a competitive process. You know, and the fantasy shelves are full of novels, and I have to compete somehow in there. So yeah, you're right. That's a big lesson. Writing it's the easy bit, selling it's the hard bit. Cool. Are we done? Is that it?
There's still the last category, which is me.
Okay.
You've already covered a lot of lessons that you've learned. But do you have any others that you could add to that?
More? God, do you want the real secrets? I haven't gotten. I'm not sure there are any more. Yeah, blood sacrifice always works. Always, never rule that out as an option. Coming back to what Fama said, is it who you know? Well, yes. And often the commissioning editors in publishing houses, the ones who choose what gets published and doesn't, are late 20s from fairly well-off London families. They're all called Sebastian. And they've all read literary fiction at this and that university. And they do tend to publish each other. They like each other's work because it has a certain literary nonsense to it.
That's cool. I'm going to Murky Books anyway.
I think there is an awareness now amongst publishers that has meant that these kind of white privileged elites have only been publishing white privileged literature, and there is now deliberate efforts to be more diverse in what they're publishing. Now is the right time, I think, to be trying to get an internship with a publishing house, because you find actually publishers will often publish the work of people they know. So if they know you, and this happens at Golands, you know, a lot of their kind of low-level junior staff end up getting published by Golands. So Mark Stay, who's a big fantasy writer, just got a job at Golands and networked through them. So I do think there are opportunities with an increasing agenda of diversity, but but the element of who you know is still important. And I was going to the fantasy convention because it was about, you know, getting even an established author's endorsement for my first book with Golands, just getting their quote on the cover. If they know you and if you bought them drinks, they'll give you an endorsement quote, which will help sell your book. So, yeah, I think it is still who you know, but there is more overt steps towards diversity as well. So I think you guys are well placed right now. Maybe. More advice? I think that's all I'm not sure I've got more advice. I think that's the lot. I tell you what, if you've got a specific thing that you want advice on, you shouldn't hesitate to email me. You're like, Adam, I've done this romance novel, but I don't know what to do with it, for example.
It sounds like the starting point is it needs to be a gay romance.
Well, I tell you what, homosexual fiction sells very well.
I mean, I can't relate to that, so I'm sorry. This won't be very commercial. This is going to be to get a good mark. Sorry, mate.
Live a little. We're all on the spectrum, apparently, Omar.
Apparently, okay. I'll try to jam it in somewhere. I don't know how I'm going to do this. Actually, no, there won't be any homosexual. Maybe there will be. I don't know.
I mean, representation. I mean, if you're gonna represent contemporary society, you would want to be representing LGBTQ, and it's important to have a positive LGBTQ character who doesn't die at the end in your book.
Yeah, don't make the black character evil.
I don't think I'll have money.
Oh man.
Yeah, you can't just have a good gay person who dies at the end, because that's called killing your darlings. You know, they have to die almost for our kind of reading pleasure, and it's like voyeurism, and it's bad. Even if they're a good character, it's not okay. So
yeah, I'm gonna stay away from the rabbit hole. I'm just gonna play it straight. It might be old-fashioned, but there you go.
There's still a market for the straight man. Still a market.
You think so?
Have you read The Buddha of Suburbia by Hanif Qureshi?
No.
Right. Maybe have a look at that.
Okay.
Yeah, you might like it. You might like it. Any more questions? Sure. Okay. Well then, there's something in the chat. What's in the chat? Yeah, okay. Yeah, I answered that one in the chat. It's like, so how can you watch the market and read the market? The Bookseller magazine, it also has a website. It will tell you which genres are big right now and what's going to be big next year in terms of what the publishers think. Publishers often guard their information and knowledge about what's going to be big, to be honest, because they don't want the competition realizing what genre is going to be big. But honestly, crime is the world's biggest selling genre. Fantasy is the second biggest selling genre, but sometimes it's YA fiction instead of fantasy. Sci-fi in terms of literary sales, not so big, but in terms of TV and film, very big. Romance, very big right now. A few years back, it was all horror, but right now it's all romance, and quite a few of you are doing romance, I believe, yeah?
Yes.
Romance is very big at the moment, and I think that's because of the pandemic. People are lonely and isolated.
Yeah.
You know? And there you are. I'll stop the recording. I think we're